The train hissed to a stop in Dry Hollow, Texas, on an August morning in 1881, and every man on that wooden platform held his breath. Because the woman who stepped down from that dusty passenger car wasn't supposed to look like that. She wasn't supposed to wear a traveling dress stitched from cloth finer than anything sold within 300 miles. She wasn't supposed to carry herself like she'd been raised in marble halls. And she sure as hell wasn't supposed to be walking straight toward Caleb Brennan, a widowed cowboy with cracked boots, a 6-year-old daughter clinging to his leg, and exactly $4.60 to his name. Before we go any further, tell me, where in the world are you watching from tonight? Drop your town in the comments. Sending love your way, wherever the wind finds you. Caleb had written for a plain wife, practical woman, someone who could cook beans, mend a torn shirt, and not run screaming when the coyotes started singing at midnight. What he got instead was a mystery with green eyes and soft hands that had clearly never touched a washboard. She told him her name was Eleanor Hartwell. She told him she was 24 years old. She told him she was ready to be his wife. She did not tell him about the iron-banded trunk the porter was struggling to unload. She did not tell him about the loaded derringer hidden in her glove. And she did not tell him that 3 men on horseback were already riding through the brush toward Dry Hollow hunting her. The wind in Dry Hollow always came from the west, dragging red dust and the smell of cattle hide across the boardwalks. On the morning Eleanor Hartwell arrived, that wind was so strong it pulled the hats off 3 men at once, and nobody bothered to chase them. They were too busy staring at her. Caleb Brennan stood at the far end of the platform with his daughter Sissy pressed against his hip. He was 29 years old, lean as a fence rail, with sun-browned skin and a jaw that hadn't been clean-shaved in nearly a week. He wore the only good shirt he owned, a faded blue cotton one his late wife Mary had sewn for him before the fever took her 2 winters back. Sissy clutched a small bunch of yellow wildflowers in her little fist. She'd picked them at sunrise. She'd wanted to give them to the new lady. Caleb had told her not to expect too much. He'd told her the woman coming on the train was probably going to be tired, plain, maybe even a little sad. That was the kind of woman who answered a marriage advertisement from a man like him. A man with calloused hands and a small ranch barely scraping by, hidden in a valley between 2 dry rivers. But the woman who stepped off that train didn't look tired. She didn't look plain. She looked like a painting come to life. Her hair was the color of dark honey, pinned up under a small green velvet hat with a single feather. Her dress was deep emerald, the kind of color Caleb had only ever seen on traveling actresses or in the windows of expensive hotels in Fort Worth. The fabric caught the morning sun and shimmered. She had a small leather valise in one gloved hand and a parasol tucked under her arm. She looked around the platform with calm, careful eyes, and when those eyes landed on Caleb, she did not flinch. She did not look disappointed. She simply walked toward him, slow and steady, like she'd been walking toward him her whole life. "You're Mr. Brennan," she said. Not a question, a statement. Caleb opened his mouth to answer, and for a long second nothing came out. He cleared his throat. "Yes, ma'am, Caleb Brennan. And this here is my daughter Sissy." Eleanor Hartwell knelt right there on the dusty platform without a second of hesitation. She lowered herself until she was eye to eye with the little girl. She smiled, and it was the kind of smile that reached all the way up into her eyes and softened something cold behind them. "Hello, Sissy," she said. "Are those flowers for me?" Sissy nodded, too shy to speak. She held them out. Eleanor took them like they were diamonds. "I think these are the prettiest flowers anyone has ever given me in my entire life," she said. And she meant it. Caleb could hear that she meant it. Behind her, the porter was struggling with something. A trunk, iron-banded, dark wood, heavy enough that he was sweating through his uniform trying to drag it down the steps. Caleb stepped forward to help, but Eleanor stood up quickly and turned. "Be careful with that, please," she said. Her voice was suddenly different, sharper, lower. "It's fragile." The porter nodded and adjusted his grip. Caleb frowned. The trunk did not look fragile. It looked like it weighed 200 pounds. He took one handle. The porter took the other. Together they lifted it down onto the boards, and Caleb felt the muscles in his back complain. Whatever was inside that trunk, it was not lace and Sunday dresses. "What you got in here, ma'am?" he asked, half joking. "Bricks." Eleanor smiled at him. The smile did not reach her eyes this time. "Books," she said. "I love to read." Caleb nodded slowly. He was a man who could read another man's face the way some folks read a Bible, and he knew, deep in his gut, that she was lying. But he also knew it was not his place to push. Not yet. Not on a platform full of staring strangers. He just touched the brim of his hat, gathered Sissy's hand, and said, "Wagons out front, ma'am. Let's get you home." They walked together down the platform, past the men who couldn't stop looking. Eleanor's gloved hand brushed against his arm. Her grip was tighter than it should have been, almost like she was holding on. It was only when they reached the wagon, only when Caleb turned to lift her up onto the bench, that he noticed something strange. Down at the far end of the dusty street, past the saloon and the livery, 3 riders had reined their horses in. They sat their saddles motionless, watching. Eleanor saw them too. Caleb felt her go still beside him. Just for a second. Just long enough that he knew. She climbed up onto the wagon bench, settled her skirts, opened her parasol, and said, very softly without looking at him, "Mr. Brennan, I think we should leave town now. Please." Caleb didn't argue. He didn't ask questions. He clucked his tongue, flicked the reins, and the 2 old mules pulled the wagon forward into the rutted road that led out of Dry Hollow. The town fell away behind them in a slow cloud of red dust. Sissy sat between them on the bench, her small body pressed against Eleanor's emerald skirt, fascinated by the strange fine fabric. For the first mile, nobody spoke. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon, the steady plod of hooves, and the distant cry of a hawk circling somewhere high above the scrub. Caleb kept his eyes on the road but his ears wide open. He was listening for hoofbeats behind them. He didn't hear any. Not yet. But that didn't mean they weren't coming. He glanced sideways at Eleanor. She was sitting very straight, her parasol angled to shield her face from the sun, her gloved hands folded in her lap. But he could see her knuckles. They were white. She was gripping her own fingers so tight the leather of her gloves was straining. "Ma'am," Caleb said quietly, "I don't know what those men back there wanted, but I'd appreciate if you told me." Eleanor was silent for a long moment. The wagon rocked over a stone. Sissy yawned and leaned against her side, and Eleanor automatically lifted an arm to settle the little girl against her, like she'd done it 100 times before, like she had instincts she shouldn't have had. Caleb noticed that too. "I'd rather not say, Mr. Brennan," she finally answered. "Not on this road. Not where the wind could carry our voices." Caleb let out a slow breath. "Eleanor, if those men are looking for you, and they come to my ranch and my daughter is there—" "They won't find me there," she said quickly. "Not tonight. Probably not for several days. I was very careful, Mr. Brennan. Covered my trail. I changed trains 4 times. I gave a false name in St. Louis. The only person in this entire territory who knows my real destination is you. And the postmaster. And I paid the postmaster well to forget." Caleb stared at her. "Your real destination?" She didn't answer. "Eleanor," he said, slower now, "is Hartwell even your real name?" She turned her head and looked at him. The parasol cast a pale green shadow across her face, and her green eyes seemed to glow inside it. She held his gaze for a long, long moment. And then she said very quietly, "It is the name I would like you to call me, if that is all right." It was not an answer, but somehow, in the way she said it, it was enough. For now. Caleb turned his eyes back to the road. The ranch was still 2 hours out. The sun was climbing. The cicadas in the brush had started their dry rattling song. He thought about turning the wagon around, taking her back to the station, putting her on the next train and washing his hands of whatever trouble she'd dragged off the eastbound line. He thought about it for almost a full minute. And then Sissy, half asleep against Eleanor's side, murmured, "Pa, she smells like roses," and Caleb knew he wasn't turning around. The land flattened out into rolling brown grass, dotted with mesquite and the white bones of dead cattle. Caleb pointed things out without thinking, the way a man does when he's nervous and trying to fill the silence. That hill over there, that was where his father had buried his first horse. That dry creek bed, that was where Sissy had learned to walk. That stand of oaks on the ridge, that was where he'd built a swing for Mary when they first married. Back when there was money for such things. Eleanor listened. She really listened. She nodded in the right places. She asked questions. She asked about Mary gently, the way a person asks about something precious. Caleb found himself talking more than he'd talked in 2 years. The ranch came into view around 3 in the afternoon. It wasn't much. A low timber house with a sagging porch, a barn that needed paint, a corral with 3 horses and a milk cow, a kitchen garden bordered by stones. The land around it was honest land but hard land. A man could work himself to bone on it and still come up short. Eleanor stared at the house. Caleb braced himself. He waited for the disappointment, the polite mask, the careful words about how charming it all looked. Instead she said, very softly, "Oh, Caleb, it's beautiful." He turned and looked at her. She wasn't lying this time. He could see it in her face. There were tears, actual tears, gathering in her green eyes. As if the sight of that battered little ranch with its sagging porch was the most welcome thing she had ever seen in her life. As if, after a long and terrible journey, she had finally come home. Caleb didn't understand. Not yet. But he was starting to. He helped her down from the wagon. He carried her valise inside. And then he went back out to lift the iron-banded trunk. He had to brace his knees to get it onto his shoulder. As he turned toward the house, his boot caught on a stone. He stumbled. The trunk slipped. The corner of it struck the edge of the porch step with a sharp, splintering crack. The latch broke. The lid fell open. And Caleb Brennan stood frozen on his own front porch, staring down at what spilled out across the boards in the afternoon sunlight. It was not books. It was gold. For a long moment Caleb did not move. He could not move. He stood there in the slanting yellow light with the broken trunk at his feet and his mouth slightly open. The gold lay across the porch boards in heavy, dull, beautiful slabs. Bars. Real gold bars. Not coins. Not jewelry. Bars, stamped with marks he did not recognize. And beneath the bars, where the lid had flopped all the way open, he could see something else. Stacks of paper. Banded bundles of United States currency. And beneath that, something darker. The black grip of a second pistol. And papers. Folded papers tied with red ribbon. Behind him, he heard the screen door creak. He heard Eleanor's footsteps freeze on the threshold. "Oh no," she whispered. "Oh no, no, no." Caleb turned around slowly. He looked at her. She was standing in the doorway with one hand pressed to her mouth, her green eyes huge above her glove. Sissy was peeking out from behind her skirts, curious, not yet old enough to understand what she was seeing. "Sissy," Caleb said, in a voice as calm as he could manage. "Honey, go to the kitchen. Go fetch me the tin cup off the shelf. The blue one. Bring it out to the well. Take your time." Sissy hesitated. Then she nodded and ran off. Children always know when their fathers have used that voice. When she was gone, Caleb looked back at Eleanor. He didn't shout. He didn't curse. He just looked at her with eyes that had gone very, very tired. "Books," he said. "Caleb, you told me books." "I know. Eleanor." He took one step closer, lowering his voice. "There is more gold on my porch right now than I will see in 10 lifetimes of working this land. Whose is it?" She lowered her hand from her mouth. She stepped out onto the porch, careful of the spilled bars, and she knelt down. She began, very calmly, to gather them up and put them back into the broken trunk. Her hands were trembling, but her movements were precise, like a woman who had handled gold before, like a woman who knew exactly how much each bar was worth. "It's mine," she said. "Every piece of it. I swear that to you on whatever you hold sacred. It is mine, Caleb. I did not steal it. I did not rob anyone. I did not cheat." "Then why are you running with it?" She looked up at him. The afternoon sun caught her face. She looked, for the first time, exactly as old as she really was. Tired, frightened, brave. Because there are men who think it should be theirs, she said. And they will kill me to take it. Caleb let out a long, slow breath. He sat down on the top porch step. He put his hat on the boards beside him. He rubbed his face with both hands. Then he looked at her again. "Tell me," he said, "all of it, right now." So she did. Her real name, she told him, was not Eleanor Hartwell. Her real name was Eleanor Vance. She was the only surviving child of Augustus Vance, a Philadelphia silver merchant who had made a great fortune during the war and an even greater one in the years that followed. Augustus Vance had died 8 months ago of a wasting sickness, leaving his entire estate to his daughter Eleanor. The will was witnessed. The will was legal. The will was clear. But Augustus Vance had a younger brother. His name was Silas Vance. And Silas Vance believed, with the deep and burning conviction of a man who has been overlooked his whole life, that everything his brother had built should rightly have come to him. Silas had stood at the funeral with cold eyes. Silas had visited the lawyer's office and demanded a copy of the will. Silas had hired 3 men, hard men, men with no names in the parlors of Philadelphia and ugly names in the alleys of Baltimore. Eleanor had known. She had seen the way her uncle looked at her. She had heard the rumors. A maid had been bribed. A coachman had been questioned. Eleanor was not a foolish woman. Eleanor had been raised by a careful father who taught her, from the time she was small, that wealth without wisdom is a death warrant. So she had moved fast. She had sold the Philadelphia house quietly through a cousin. She had converted the bonds. She had taken a portion of the family wealth in gold bars and in cash, because gold did not depend on banks and banks did not depend on the loyalty of clerks. She had left the rest in a Boston account under a false name only she knew. And then, the night before her uncle was due to arrive with his lawyers and his 3 hired men, Eleanor Vance had walked out of her father's house through the kitchen door wearing a maid's coat, carrying nothing but a leather valise and a small derringer her father had pressed into her hand the week before he died. "And the marriage advertisement?" Caleb said. He was watching her now with something new in his eyes. Not anger. Something more complicated. Eleanor lowered her gaze. "I needed a place to disappear," she said. "I needed a name that was not mine. I needed a small ranch in a small valley in a part of the country where no man in a Philadelphia office would ever think to look for me. I read the advertisements in the Western papers for 3 months. I read hundreds of them. And then I read yours." "Mine," Caleb said. She nodded. She reached into the trunk and pulled out a folded paper. It was worn at the edges. It had clearly been folded and unfolded many, many times. She held it out to him. He took it. It was the advertisement he had placed in the Kansas City Star 9 months ago. He remembered writing it. He had been drunk when he wrote it. He had been lonely. He had been desperate. He read it again now. He read his own words. Widower, 29, with 1 small daughter. Honest work, honest land, no debts. Seeking a kind woman of patient nature. Not looking for beauty. Looking for a good heart. Will treat her gentle all my days. Eleanor said very softly, "I read that, Mr. Brennan, and I cried, because I have been around rich men my whole life. And I have never read words so honest in any of them." Caleb folded the paper. He put it carefully in his shirt pocket. He looked at her for a long time. And then, far off, somewhere down the road that led from Dry Hollow, the wind carried a sound that froze him to the bone. Hoofbeats. 3 sets. Riding hard. Caleb was on his feet before he knew he was moving. He grabbed the lid of the broken trunk and slammed it shut as best he could. He tilted the whole thing up onto its end and dragged it inside the house, scraping a long pale line across his weathered porch boards. Eleanor was already moving with him. She did not ask what to do. She did not panic. She lifted her skirts and ran to the kitchen, calling for Sissy in a voice that was steady but firm. "Sissy, baby, come here. Come to me right now. We're going to play a quiet game." Caleb hauled the trunk into the bedroom, the small dim room at the back of the house where Mary had once slept beside him. He shoved it under the bed. He threw a quilt over the part that stuck out. He grabbed the rifle off the wall above the headboard. He checked the chamber. It was loaded. It was always loaded. A man with a child on a lonely ranch did not keep an empty rifle. He came back into the front room. Eleanor was standing by the window with Sissy in her arms. She had pulled the little girl up against her chest and was murmuring something into her hair. Sissy was wide-eyed but not crying. Eleanor's other hand was inside her traveling bag. When she drew it out, Caleb saw what she was holding. A small silver derringer. 2 barrels. Pearl handle. A rich woman's weapon. But the way she held it was not rich. It was practiced. Her thumb was already on the hammer. The hoofbeats were close now. They had slowed. Caleb stepped to the side of the window and peered through the gap in the curtain. 3 riders. They were exactly the 3 men he had seen at the edge of Dry Hollow. They reined in 20 yards from the porch, sitting their horses in a loose, careful arrangement. They were not bunched. They were spread out, the way men spread out when they expect there might be shooting. The middle rider was tall and lean, dressed in a dark coat that was too heavy for the Texas heat. He had a long, narrow face and pale eyes. He raised a gloved hand and called out, friendly as anything. "Hello, the house. We're looking for a young lady, traveling alone. Dark blonde hair, green eyes. She might have come this way today on a wagon out of Dry Hollow. We mean her no harm. We're family. There's been a misunderstanding back east, and we've come to bring her home." Caleb did not answer. He glanced at Eleanor. Her face had gone the color of old paper. She shook her head, just once, very small. "That is not my uncle," her eyes said. "But that is one of his men." Caleb cocked the rifle. The sound was small, but it carried. He stepped out onto the porch. Just a foot or 2. Just enough that they could see him and see the gun. "Don't know any lady like that," he said. His voice was easy, almost lazy. "Ain't seen nobody on the road all day but my mules. You boys are welcome to water at the creek a 1/4 mile down. After that, I'd appreciate you riding on." The middle rider smiled. It was not a smile. It was a stretching of the mouth. "Friend," he said. "We were told a man came in this morning to meet the eastbound train. Tall fellow, brown hair, little girl with him. Folks said he took a lady in green up the north road. We'd appreciate a closer look at your barn, if it's no trouble." "It is trouble," Caleb said. The middle rider looked at the man on his right. The man on the right was shorter, broader, with a scar that ran from the corner of his mouth all the way up to his ear. He shifted in his saddle. His hand drifted toward the pistol on his hip. Caleb raised the rifle. "Not all the way, just enough." He said, "Ride on." For a long, brittle second nobody moved. The sun was getting low. The shadows of the riders stretched long and thin across the dust of his yard. A jackrabbit broke from a clump of sage and dashed off into the brush. A hawk cried somewhere far above. The middle rider tipped his hat. "All right, friend," he said. "All right, we'll ride on. You have a real fine evening now. Tell your wife we said hello." He had said it on purpose. Your wife. He knew. He had to know. He had been told something at the station. Or somebody in Dry Hollow had talked. Of course somebody had talked. 3 strangers asking questions and putting silver dollars on the bar in a town like Dry Hollow. Somebody was always going to talk. The 3 riders turned their horses. They rode slowly back down the road. They did not look back. They did not need to. They were not leaving. Caleb knew it the way a man knows a storm is coming when the sky still looks blue. He stepped back inside. He closed the door. He slid the wooden bar across it. He drew the curtains. He turned to Eleanor. "They'll be back tonight," he said. "After dark. They'll come around through the brush. Probably split up. One on the barn, one on the kitchen, one on the bedroom window. That's how I'd do it if I was them." Eleanor was still holding Sissy. She had not lowered the derringer. Her face was set, calm. Far calmer than a woman in a parlor in Philadelphia had any right to be. "What do we do?" she asked. Caleb almost smiled. He almost did. Because she had said we. He thought about it. He thought about it for one long moment. Then he set the rifle against the wall, knelt down in front of Sissy, and took his daughter's small face in both of his big rough hands. "Sissy, honey," he said, "remember the cellar? The one I told you was only for the worst storms." Sissy nodded. "It's a storm tonight, baby. The worst kind. I need you to go down there with Miss Eleanor. I need you to be the bravest little girl in Texas. Can you do that?" Sissy nodded again. Her bottom lip trembled, but she did not cry. Caleb stood up. He looked at Eleanor over his daughter's head. "Get in the cellar," he said. "Both of you. Bar it from the inside. Don't come out for any voice you hear except mine. And if you hear shooting—" He paused. He swallowed. "If you hear shooting and it stops and I do not come for you by sunrise, you take that derringer, you take my daughter, and you ride east at first light to the next town. And you do not look back." Eleanor stared at him. There were tears in her eyes again, but her voice, when it came, was steel. "No," she said. "I am not hiding in a cellar while you die for me, Caleb Brennan. I have run from these men once. I will not run from them again." And outside, in the long red light of the dying sun, the dust of 3 riders settled back over the road. And somewhere in the brush beyond the corral, very faint, came the sound of a horse being tied to a tree. The sun went down behind the western ridges and the world turned the color of a bruise. Caleb did not light the lamps inside the house. He did not light the stove. He moved through the rooms in the gathering dark with the silence of a man who had once tracked Comanche raiders in his younger years and had never quite unlearned how to walk without making the boards creak. He had argued with Eleanor for 10 more minutes. He had begged. He had finally, in a low and tired voice, given up. She would not go in the cellar. But Sissy would. Sissy was tucked down there now beneath the kitchen floor with a candle, a blanket, a piece of bread, and a wooden doll Mary had carved for her when she was 3. The trapdoor was barred from the inside. Caleb had shown his daughter how to lift the latch and had made her promise, on her dead mother's name, not to lift it for any voice that was not his. Eleanor stood in the bedroom now by the window. She had taken off her emerald dress. She had unpinned her hair. She was wearing one of Mary's old shirts, sleeves rolled to her elbows, and a pair of Mary's old riding trousers. The clothes did not fit her well, but they did not need to. They simply needed to not shine in the dark. She had braided her honey hair into a tight rope down her back. The derringer was in her right hand. A loaded Colt revolver that Caleb had pressed into her left hand was now resting on the windowsill beside her. She had told him, very quietly, that her father had taught her to shoot at the age of 11. She had told him she could put 6 rounds into a playing card at 20 paces. Caleb had nodded, and he had believed her, because there was no longer anything about this woman that surprised him. He was in the front room, crouched low, the rifle across his knees. He had pulled the curtain back just enough to watch the yard. The moon was a thin sickle. The stars were sharp. The wind had died. He could hear the milk cow shifting in the barn. He could hear the slow creak of the old windmill turning. He could hear, very far away, the long, sad call of a coyote. And then, somewhere in the brush beyond the corral, he heard a dry stick break. It was almost nothing. A man who had not lived in this valley his whole life would not have heard it. But Caleb heard it. He went very still. A second sound. The soft scrape of leather on stone. Closer to the barn now. A third sound, much farther, from the east side of the house, in the direction of the kitchen garden. A boot in soft dirt. 2 of them, maybe 3. He could not tell where the third was. He hissed, very low, between his teeth. It was a signal he and Eleanor had agreed on. Back in the bedroom, he heard the soft click of a hammer being drawn back. The first man came around the corner of the barn. Caleb saw him as a shape, a darker piece of darkness, moving along the corral fence. He was the broad one, the one with the scar. He had a pistol drawn and held low against his thigh. He was good. He was very good. He moved in a low crouch, using the fence posts to break up his silhouette. He was heading toward the front porch. The second man Caleb saw out of the corner of his eye, slipping around the side of the kitchen. He was the third rider from earlier, the one who had not spoken. He was carrying a shotgun. The tall one with the long coat was nowhere to be seen. That was the one Caleb worried about. The broad man with the scar reached the porch. He was 3 feet from the front door now. He raised his pistol. He pointed it at the door's lock. He was going to shoot the lock and kick the door in. Caleb knew it. Caleb had 2 seconds. Caleb raised the rifle. He sighted through the gap in the curtain. He squeezed the trigger. The window exploded. The rifle's blast tore the night open like a sheet of canvas. The broad man with the scar staggered backward off the porch and hit the dust on his back and did not get up. The shotgun roared from the side of the house. Splinters flew from the kitchen wall. Caleb was already moving. He rolled across the floor, came up against the wall, worked the lever, ejected the brass, chambered a new round. From the bedroom, Eleanor's pistol cracked twice. He heard a man shout. The shout cut off into a wet, choking sound. Then silence. 2 down. Caleb's heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his teeth. The third one. Where was the third one? He crawled toward the bedroom door. Eleanor, he whispered. Eleanor, you all right? Yes. Her voice was shaking now. Just a little. The reality of what she had just done was beginning to land on her. Yes, I am alive. Caleb, the tall one. I have not seen the tall one. I know. Caleb. Her voice dropped to almost nothing. The cellar. He has gone for the cellar. Caleb's blood turned to ice. He stood up. He did not crouch anymore. He did not move quietly anymore. He moved through that house with the rifle in his hands and the cold fury of every father who has ever lived in the history of the world. He kicked open the door to the kitchen. The tall man in the long coat was standing on the kitchen floor, directly over the trapdoor to the cellar. He had pried up one corner with the blade of a long knife. He was bent low. He had not heard Caleb come in over the sound of his own work. He looked up. He had pale eyes. They went wide. He started to bring up his pistol. He was not fast enough. The rifle in Caleb Brennan's hands was the last thing he ever saw. The silence that came after was the loudest silence Caleb had ever heard. He stood there in the kitchen for a long, long moment, breathing hard, the barrel of the rifle still hot, the smell of gunpowder thick in the air. Slowly, very slowly, he became aware of small sounds again. The creak of the windmill, the shifting of the cow, and, beneath his boots, beneath the splintered edge of the trapdoor, a small, trembling voice. Pa? Pa, was that you? Pa, was that you shooting? Caleb dropped the rifle. He dropped to his knees on the kitchen floor. He yanked the trapdoor open with both hands. And there in the candlelight below was his daughter, white-faced, eyes huge, the wooden doll clutched against her chest. He went down those cellar steps 3 at a time. He gathered her up into his arms. He held her so tight he could feel her small heart hammering against his ribs. He pressed his face into her hair, and he wept. He had not wept since the day they put Mary in the ground. Eleanor came down the steps behind him. She was still holding the smoking colt. She set it on the dirt floor of the cellar. She knelt down beside them. She wrapped her arms around them both. And the 3 of them stayed there like that on the cellar floor in the candlelight in the silence for a very long time. They buried the 3 men at first light, in the brush behind the corral, in unmarked graves. Caleb wrote a careful letter to the sheriff in Dry Hollow that same morning, explaining that 3 strangers had attempted to rob his home in the night and had been killed in the defense of his family. The sheriff rode out 2 days later. He looked at the broken kitchen window. He looked at the splinters in the wall. He looked at little Sissy, and he looked at Caleb, and he looked at the quiet woman in the plain dress who was kneading bread at the kitchen table. He tipped his hat. He said, "Sometimes the world rids itself of bad men, Mr. Brennan. Sometimes that's all there is to say about it." He rode away. He never came back. A month later, a letter arrived in Dry Hollow, sent to a name nobody knew, from a lawyer in Philadelphia. Silas Vance had been arrested for the attempted murder of his niece. A maid had finally talked. A coachman had finally testified. The Vance estate, in its entirety, was now legally and undisputedly the property of Eleanor Vance, wherever she might be found. Eleanor never went back to claim it. Not all of it. She wrote to the lawyer. She had him sell the Philadelphia house and donate the proceeds to a home for orphan girls. She had him liquidate most of the bonds and place them in a trust for the same. The Boston account she left alone. A woman with a daughter and a husband and a small hard ranch in a small dry valley, she told herself, did not need a Philadelphia fortune. She only needed enough. But enough, it turned out, was quite a lot. By the next spring, the Brennan Ranch had a new roof, a new barn, 60 head of cattle where before there had been 12. A schoolteacher had been hired for the children of Dry Hollow, paid for anonymously by a benefactor nobody could ever quite identify. Sissy had a brand new dress for her 7th birthday, and a pony of her very own, and a mother who read to her every night by the lamplight and taught her, as she grew older, how to shoot a derringer at 20 paces and how to read a man's face the way her father read the Bible. Caleb married Eleanor properly in the little white chapel in Dry Hollow on a Sunday in October. She wore the emerald dress she had stepped off the train in. He wore the blue shirt Mary had made. Sissy carried yellow wildflowers. Nobody in the church knew the truth of what had happened on that ranch the August before. Nobody ever would. And on quiet evenings, sitting on the new porch he had built with his own 2 hands, Caleb Brennan would sometimes look at his wife in the long red light of the dying sun, and he would shake his head, and he would smile. He had written for a plain wife, practical woman, someone who could cook beans and mend a torn shirt. What he had gotten was the love of his life, the courage of 10 men, a daughter saved, a home rebuilt, and a fortune neither of them had ever really needed. He had gotten everything. What would you have done in his place that morning on the platform when the woman who stepped off the train was not the woman you'd written for? Would you have turned the wagon around? Would you have asked the questions? Or would you, like Caleb, have simply lifted the trunk and taken her home? Tell me in the comments. And wherever in this wide world you're watching from tonight, sleep safe. The wind is still out there, and so are the stories. If the story moved you, leave a single word in the comments, the name of the town you'd ride to if you ever needed to disappear. We read every one.